Happy 4th of July to all of my viewers within the United States. Now, Americans love to celebrate the nation's birthday, but this year it's even more special, or at least it seems, because we are commemorating it as the semi-quincentennial, the 250 years since the Declaration of Independence was declared. Now, we can get into a whole debate about when America was really birthed. Was it in 1776? Was it in 1775 when the first shots were fired? Was it in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris? These are all, abstractions that often reveal to us a lot about the present, just as much as it does about the past. But we're going to set all of that aside, and we're going to talk about the American Revolution, because there are lots of events taking place this weekend. But besides all the pomp and circumstance, these celebrations often prompt a lot of historical thinking and a lot of interest in what we can learn from the Revolution, because Americans love their history. And we think that we can learn a lot from the past that will tell us a lot about the present. That there's something about the American character that was birthed in 1776 that was embedded within our culture today. And so we look to the past to understand the road that brought us to this moment, hoping that there is a core part of our identity that can be deciphered. And our present context often prompts the questions that we ask about the past. Now, our answers need to be rooted in the context and evidence from the past, but it's good to take new circumstances that make us reflect and revise how we approach the past. And so with any major commemoration, there are many historians who are going to take advantage of this moment and produce new histories. This is why you see a slew of new books whenever there's a major anniversary. And this is especially the case with the 250th anniversary of America's founding. And as someone who frequently teaches courses on the American Revolution, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, I read a lot of books on the American Revolution. I assign a lot of books on the American Revolution, as my students will tell you, which means I like to keep up with the historiography, so I'm very interested to see what this current moment will bring us. So today, I want to highlight some of the latest and greatest of the American Revolutionary scholarship. View this as the how-to guide for new books on the American Revolution. And spoiler, I like the books that I'm highlighting here. I don't talk about the books that I don't like. I'm just going to highlight the ones that I strongly recommend, depending on what type of history you're into and what insights you want to glean. And I'm going to spend most of my time at the end of the video with my new favorite synthesis, or a general overview of the Revolution, Sarah Pearsall's Freedom Round the Globe, a world history of the American Revolution. And I'm going to interview the author, Dr. Sarah Pearsall, in this video. So she will answer my questions about why we need another synthesis on the Revolution and what her synthesis offers that previous books did not. And then I'll conclude with a few thoughts of what these new histories tell us, not just about the Revolution, but the current moment we're now in. Because again, historical work often tells us about the culture in which it's created, just as much as it tells us about the past. That's a lot to cover. So let's dig in. Trust me when I say that there are a lot of new books on the American Revolution this year. I'm going to be attending the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, the leading scholarly organization for studying America from the Revolution to the Civil War. And there are entire panels with the authors of these new books talking about how they relate to one another. And I want to highlight just a half dozen here. Now, a few caveats before I get into this whirlwind overview of these new revolutionary books that I promise is worthwhile, because you're going to hear a book that you will want to read. One, I haven't read everything. I tried to. I've read probably a dozen books on the American Revolution this year, but I can't get to all of them. Two, when it comes to promoting books, I typically promote books that are written by academics, but for a general audience. I trust academics more than I do popular historians, because they recognize the rigor necessary to engage the past, although there are some great, amateur historians who've written it. And I'm promoting books that are written for a general audience that you will be interested in, and you won't get lost in, the historiographical debates. And while I will be spending time on only a half dozen books, I will be pointing toward other books that you can also read if you're interested. So the first book I want to highlight actually came out at the end of last year. This book is worth highlighting, even though it came out at the end of 2025, because I think it's so readable. Richard Bell's The American Revolution and the Fate of the World is a kaleidoscope of diverse stories and characters, each chapter focusing on a different person who reflects a type of perspective or background that typically gets overlooked. So we see more about the Irish soldiers, the American loyalists, the indigenous chiefs, the Australian fugitives, as well as key figures like Benjamin Franklin. It's framed also as a series of lectures. So every chapter starts at the beginning of the revolution, goes towards the end, showing the broad diaspora of the American story on a much more global stage than you might think. And so as a result, it's very accessible. It's probably the most accessible of all the American Revolutionary books that I'm highlighting today. And bonus, if you listen to the audiobook, you get to listen to Richard Bell, the author, a good friend of mine, his gorgeous British accent, which just, disrupts your American exceptionalist mindset a bit. Second book I want to highlight is Robert Parkinson's Tyrants and Rogues, Understanding the Declaration of Independence. Now, Robert Parkinson is the author of several groundbreaking books on the revolution, especially with the concept of race and the creation of a unified racial theory that brought the colonies together. He's also read more newspapers from the Revolutionary era than likely anyone else. So he knows the print discourse. And he is looking at the Declaration of Independence, which you likely think you know. But instead, he overturns common assumptions, saying that the portions that we focus on, the philosophical statements of when in the course of human events, or we hold these truths to be self-evident, the portions that you actually memorize, those aren't the portions that were most important in 1776. Instead, he focuses on the 27 grievances that make up the brunt of the Declaration. The parts you skip over when you read the Declaration. He says these received, 1, the most attention from Thomas Jefferson when he was drafting the Declaration. 2, they received the most attention when the Continental Congress engaged and edited the Declaration. And 3, all the responses to the Declaration, especially from the British Empire, but also at the common level, also focused on the grievances rather than the philosophical statements, which would later become significant. And by looking at these grievances, we learn a lot about the American Revolution, not just what they saw as a necessary build-up of conspiracies that justified dissension from the British Empire, but also we learn about the marginalized people who shaped the American story because it was their actions that prompted a response from the British government that in turn set the wheels in motion for the revolution. So it captures this chronology and the broad scope so we can get into the passion and, importantly, questions that are still relevant to the American story today. Questions like the all-power executive, the dangers of a standing army and police force, the nature of legislative rights and judicial equality. Questions that America is still wrestling with in 2026, just like they were in 1776. All right, sticking with the author of the Declaration of Independence, the third book I want to highlight is Peter Onuf and Francis Cogliano's Thomas Jefferson Survives, Independence in His Time and Ours. Now, Onuf and Cogliano are two of the foremost experts on Thomas Jefferson. They've each written several books on Jefferson. Onuf actually held the Thomas Jefferson Chair at the University of Virginia. And in this very brief book, they offer 3 overarching essays on some of the most important concepts in Jefferson's mind: the space of the continent, the nation of the United States, and the people of the country, showing both the broad optimism of Jefferson's vision as well as the limits of his ideas. I was struck by the optimism that Jefferson had for future generations, always able to improve on the present, even while acknowledging the dark side of that optimism because, if we don't solve slavery now, a future generation will deal with it. And of course, it took nearly 700,000 lives lost to finally solve that crisis. So if you really want to dig into Jefferson, this is a book. Now, I also want to highlight a book I haven't read yet, but I really like the authors, and it's next on my read list, and I'm sure it's great. That's Krista Dirkscheid and Nicholas Guyot's Jefferson's Wolf, a Founding Fathers' Troubling Answer to the Problem of Slavery. That digs in specifically on Jefferson's view of race and slavery, showing both his anti-slavery impulses, but also his pro-slavery realities, helping reconcile the contradiction that is America's authorial founding father. And if you want to get into Jefferson and race in more depth, Annette Gordon-Reed, who is the scholar on Thomas Jefferson, put out an edited volume with Princeton University Press, Jefferson on Race, a Reader, that collects many documents from Jefferson's life, from his pen or quill, about race so that you can actually wrestle with it yourself. All right, but we're not done with founding fathers and wrestling with race, because the next book I want to highlight is John Garrison Marks' Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory, which not only deals with how George Washington dealt with slavery, but also how Americans since Washington's death has continued to grapple with what did it mean? What does it mean that Washington, the founder of the nation, was also the paternalistic overseer of a slave plantation? And this story is, of course, relevant because just last year, the current White House administration ordered the plaques that detailed slavery at Washington's presidential mansion in Philadelphia to be removed, only for a court order to return them. So how we wrestle with that memory tells us a lot about ourselves and our history. And Marx's book does a great job with that. Also, if you just want to dip your toes into American Revolutionary historiography, there's a couple of edited volumes that I really like. One I've already read, one that's on my pile to read. I told you, I warned you, this to-read pile is really deep. But Francis Cogliano, one of the co-authors of the Thomas Jefferson Survives book, edited a volume, The American Revolution at 250, 24 historians reflect on the founding. These 24 very brief, very engaging essays cover a variety of topics from many different backgrounds. So if you just want to dip your toes into the American Revolution, this might be the book for you. These articles are punchy. They summarize some of the most important works. In fact, almost all the authors I'm highlighting in today's video have short essays in this volume, so you can get a preview of the bigger books, and then you can decide whether if you want to get them. There's also, I haven't read this volume yet, but I heard good things, Nicholas Popper's edited volume, The American Revolution, Essays on the Founding Era, which collects some of the most important historiographical and historical articles on the Revolution from the William and Mary Quarterly, the most important scholarly organization focused on early American history. So those might be a bit more scholarly than the other works I'm highlighting, but if you really want to geek out about the history, that would be a great volume. And finally, I want to highlight two books that discuss the legacies of the Revolution. One is Thomas Richard's The Unfinished Business of 1776, Why the Revolution Never Ended, which looks at a cast of characters, each chapter focusing on a different figure, who try to revise the revolutionary legacy, expand its parameters, and be more inclusive of who gets to inherit those promises, whether it be women's rights suffragists or enslaved laborers and their insurrections, or even the Mormons. There's a chapter on Joseph Smith and the Mormons trying to carve out their place in the American Republic, fulfilling in their minds the visions of the Revolution. And finally, a book I want to shout out that I haven't read yet, but I really respect the author, Nathan Pearl Rosenthal's book, The Long Revolution, Creating a United States After 1776, also offers this broad scope of the legacies of the Revolution and how we're still fighting for them. Like I warned you, there's a lot of great books, but now we need to look at the one that I probably loved the most. Now, before we get into the big book, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of historical content where we get to geek out about history, and I use that in a loving way, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. Every Monday I do deep dives on topics. Every Wednesday I try to collapse the past and the present to understand how we got to the present moment by talking about modern news and politics and culture. And then on Fridays, I pull back the curtains to talk about the historian's craft, either interviewing authors like today, highlighting classic books, or looking at the sources behind common historiographical arguments so that you too can become an expert. And if you want to give back to the channel, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, please become a member, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your names when you leave comments, and most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship. I also recommend following me on my different platforms, especially Instagram, where I provide supplemental information and videos, and you can subscribe to my free Kit newsletter, where I send out announcements and links and updates every other week or so. Links to all of those are in the video description. That's all I got on the business, so let's get back to the books. All the other books I've highlighted so far look at bits and pieces or one aspect of the revolution. It's a much harder task, probably, to cover the entirety of the revolution, especially when you're broadening the scope. But those books are so important. When I teach classes on the American Revolution, I'm always yearning, searching for a book that offers a synthesis, a broad overview that incorporates all the recent historiographical interventions so that my students or general readers can pick them up. Fortunately, we have a book that does that offers a broad cast of characters, that expands the geography, and disrupts our notions of exceptionalism. Sarah Pearsall's brand new book, Freedom Round the Globe, A World History of the American Revolution, is a phenomenal read, or an audiobook if you want to digest it how I did. It has several key focuses. While many books have focused on the American Revolution as shaped the world, this one looks at how the world shaped the American Revolution. And so it looks at the revolution as a series of what she calls nesting dolls, looking at the broader context to the narrow context all the way to the domestic context. Every chapter is framed around a different global site as well as a key term from the Declaration. So you have chapters that open up with in Edinburgh, or in West Africa, or in the Caribbean, or in Quebec, or in the indigenous lands of Detroit. But beyond just broadening the geographic scope, it broadens the scope of whose voices get to be heard. You hear stories that are going on in a home with women seeking for more autonomy over their body, or in indigenous nations where they're trying to preserve their homeland, as well as the stories of Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Those folks don't get neglected. They are just integrated into a much broader tapestry, a canvas that is rich and diverse and relevant to our modern world. The author, Sarah Pearsall, has taught at universities on both sides of the Atlantic. So she taught at the University of Cambridge and in Oxford, and she's taught in America at Northwestern, and now she's a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, one of the elite history programs in the nation. She's authored a number of award-winning books, including a book that many of my viewers might be familiar with, Polygamy and Early American History, which in 8 chapters, Mormons take up the last chapter. It looks at how polygamy is understood and lived even before the Latter-day Saints. She's received fellowships from every distinguished organization, as well as was appointed distinguished fellows at like the Royal Historical Society and many other places. In other words, she's a rock star. And I'm also biased because she's not just a phenomenal human and brilliant historian, but she was one of my advisors at the University of Cambridge. So I'm very grateful that she gave up some of her time to talk with me about her new book. Now, just a warning, there are a few technical issues. The quality is not ideal, and that's all on my end. I had a few technical difficulties when we tried to record the video today, so we ended up having to use Zoom rather than my typical streaming services, which means it's already lower quality. And further, for whatever reason, my Wi-Fi and computer weren't acting well, so I am very choppy, but I think all of Dr. Pearsall's words come through clear. So ignore me, which is typically good advice, and focus on the brilliance of Dr. Pearsall as we discuss her new book, Freedom Round the Globe. All right, and I am now pleased to be joined by the author of the book, Dr. Sarah Pearsall. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on this.
So, Dr. Pearsall, as someone who has taught the revolution for a long time, you know better than anyone that there is a mountain of books on the American Revolution. So I'm curious,
Absolutely.
what led you to decide that, hey, there's still room for another, especially given your own background?
Well, it was actually really from teaching. I was teaching at Cambridge University. I decided to teach a year-long course on the American Revolution, and I decided to focus it on sort of the world beyond the 13 colonies. And in doing that, of course, I started teaching in 2018. I felt like there was a really, really interesting story here, but there wasn't really a book that gave that story. There were a lot of disparate articles and some books that dealt with certain aspects. There was work on Canada, or there was work on the French Alliance, but there weren't really any books that sort of tried to bring it all together. Or of those that did think about a kind of global war or the effects of the American Revolution on the world, they didn't really think about the effect of the world on the revolution, nor did they necessarily have a sort of wider cast of characters. Those that tended to be international tended to be sort of high diplomacy and war. And I wanted something that was a much more bottom-up account of this sort of international panorama. And that's what I ultimately decided, that I should not just teach the course, but in fact, write the book that came out of it. So that's what I've done.
Yeah, I have a hard time fathoming how you tackled so much material because you're broadening the narrative of the American Revolution in many ways, in geography, in characters, and in topics. So let's start with the geography first, because you have chapters that are situated or at least framed around these places that typically don't get a lot of attention in the American Revolution, whether it be Quebec, the Caribbean, Edinburgh, West Africa, even a failed British invasion of South America, and while still, of course, giving Boston and Philadelphia her due. So how does our perspective of the revolution change when we take into account this much larger playing field that was at stake during the 1770s?
Well, I think we learn all kinds of things. I mean, first of all, we correct a kind of exceptionalist narrative of the American Revolution that is seeking to explain why and how resistance built, and the 13 colonies were sort of able to affect rebellion and ultimately revolution. Because our questions, if we widen the scope, become rather different. Those questions remain on the table. But then we also have to answer, if we know, as we do, that in fact there were not 13 British North American colonies, but at least 26, depending slightly on how you count them, whether you count certain Caribbean islands as one or two, etc., but at least double that number, then the question becomes a little different. Why did these colonies join? Why did these other ones, where there was also resistance at various stages, why did they not join? And why did this revolution ultimately take the shape that it did? We can't really answer those questions if we don't sort of look at that broader world. At the same time, I think we can't really understand the origins of the ideals of the revolution, of larger transformations that were contemporaneous and often driving change in this period in complicated and important ways. Rise in global trade, in globalization more generally, in print and communication, all of those kinds of changes that were also driving change. And sometimes I fear that American historians, in sort of seeking that exceptionalist line, have tended too much to see the driver of change as the political American Revolution and not attended enough to those other forms of change. And when we look at this broader canvas, we can sort of essentially use them as a kind of control group for what's going on in the 13 colonies. And I think we also ultimately can't really explain the course of the war, that's kind of my third point, without understanding this broader world, because the British are looking at that whole world and they're making calculations about how to proceed or not proceed with this war based on that. So I think if we don't also have a kind of global sense, then we lose that ability to explain behavior during the war itself.
Yeah, and another way that you broaden the canvas is you're not only zooming out with the geography, but you're also zooming in on the household, arguing that changes or the lack of changes that took place in the domestic setting are just as significant as what's taking place on the battlefield or the state house. So, for instance, you talk about the 1770s as this fertility revolution. So why is it important to understand these contested spaces at home, not just abroad or in the political sphere?
Well, I think partly we only can understand some of these larger changes, as I say, by thinking about the ways that these other kinds of changes, which may or may not be specifically sort of political decisions of the American Revolution and the Founding Fathers, are driving change in this period. One of those changes is, this shift that historians have identified looking at demography, that the U.S. is essentially the first nation to sort of limit family size. And the work that's been done, wonderful work by Susan Klepp and others on this question, has tended to sort of argue that the American Revolution was a sort of major driver of this shift. But I'm not convinced by that causality. I'm actually more persuaded that the reverse is true. That is, birth control is frequently, as Angus McLaren, a sort of noted scholar of that topic, has said, is about a sort of revolution of rising expectations. And it seems to me that rising expectations are to be found both in sort of new ways of family planning and organization and in the revolution. And in fact, it's rising expectations that are driving both the domestic and the political revolution. So I think we sort of misidentify the causality and we see the politics as the driver in a way that I think isn't quite correct. So that was something I was eager to sort of change in people's thinking. I also look, for example, at women's greater public participation in debates on politics and other topics in this period, which were also taking place in Scotland and in Ireland and in England. And so I think if we say it's the American Revolution that's opening things up for women, we have to question that, because that revolution not taking place in these other things, yet these same sort of transformations are taking place. So I think it sort of, again, just sort of changes a little bit how we see that process.
Yeah. And speaking about changing how we conceive certain things, it's not enough for you to broaden the geographic scope or to change the characters on the player field. You're also challenging the terms at the heart of the revolution. And every chapter is focused on a term that's prominently placed in the Declaration of Independence, terms like liberty, civility, and honor, that you show meant different things to different people, which is often a launching ground to see the diversity of experiences. So why do you think it's important to unsettle our traditional and often very certain definitions of these terms that are at the heart of our national identity?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. And in a sense, it's not so much that we're certain. I'd say it's more that they're unexamined or they're taken for granted. The phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you ask anybody about the Declaration of Independence, that's the phrase that they could probably dredge up, though in my experience they will also dredge up something like We the People, which is actually from the Constitution. And the conflation of those two documents is, to me, sort of a bit of a problem, but extremely common. And partly, I think, what do we mean? What did they mean by happiness, for example? And that is actually a complicated word in this era. That's also undergoing transformation, that has multiple meanings. There's private happiness and there's public happiness, and people are meant to work for both of those things. There's also an idea that there's an argument, in any case, that only certain kinds of people can experience true happiness, that you have to be a sensible, essentially educated, elite person to be able to experience true happiness, while others are saying that's not true. Everyone can be happy, equally happy. And this debate actually involves some of the sort of greatest thinkers of this era, including people like David Hume, in what does happiness mean. But if we forget all that, then we sort of are left with this slightly vacuous life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, sometimes, pointed to Locke and John Locke and his sort of ideas about pursuing happiness, which obviously are part of what's going on. But I think it's a more complicated story. Still, I chose these words, which are all from the Declaration of Independence, as really a way of structuring what obviously could have been a pretty sprawling and cacophonous kind of account. And in fact, I did it and chose a key word for each chapter in order to kind of center and give the reader a kind of peg on which to hang some of the individual stories. And that I found was a reasonably effective way to sort of get readers into the period and to sort of help them navigate the kinds of changes that are going on, both in terms of politics and in terms of kind of ideas and actions.
Yeah, I love the part in the book where you discuss this debate club in Edinburgh that had just admitted women. Then debating happiness at the very time that Thomas Jefferson is inserting that term. So it's just a great example of the broader discussion going on, of which the revolutionary discourse is just part. So finally, you close the book with not with the triumph of America becoming, this global Goliath, but with a degree of uncertainty and unsettling that sense of exceptionalism. You have a chapter on trade in China and how the future of the American marketplace seems, at risk. And then, of course, you've finished with the chapter on equality. And what does equality mean for these various groups of people, including the enslaved? So pardon me, we are living in 2026 America, where we have a bit more of a dour spirit on the results. Do you think that this story of uncertainty is both born out of our present day questions, or what lessons do you think that has for us in the present day?
That's a really interesting question. I would say the book acknowledges the complications and the contradictions of this era, which were many, like ours. I would say, though, it's not dour. It's done with an acknowledgement of those complications, but also a light touch. And in fact, part of what I'm arguing in the chapter on China, which is about the 1780s and the period in which the Articles of Confederation is the sort of structure of government in the new United States. This is before the Constitutional Convention. Okay, in my opinion, the 1780s is a really interesting and strange period, and one that deserves new and different treatment, actually, though I'm not planning to do it. But I exhort others, if they're interested, to think about doing more work on this. So in fact, what I'm arguing in that chapter is that although we've sort of bought generally hook, line, and sinker the story crafted by those who ultimately held the Constitutional Convention and passed the Constitution, that everything was going, to hell in a handbasket in the 1780s, and that people were miserable, that everything was verging on anarchy, that everything was about to crumble, that it was absolutely horrible, that in fact it wasn't, and people didn't know the Constitution was coming in the 1780s. They were just getting on with things, and frequently they were doing so with quite a bit of hustle and even some optimism. It is true the economy is not doing well, but that's very common in a post-war period. And people are trying to figure out different ways to make money, going to China being one of them, selling ginseng and essentially Spanish silver to the Chinese for commodities like tea and porcelain and textiles. These are something that Americans are pursuing in the 1780s. And I think if we sort of start there, we see that 1780s period in a somewhat different way. I do think that the contradictions of equality and the lack thereof in that period are something that Americans and others need to grapple with. And I do so by essentially comparing the U.S. with the Sierra Leone settlement in West Africa, where they really try to live the principle of equality and they really try to distribute property in an equal way. And it's not really a great success. And I try to think about what the sort of global forces of slavery and trade are sort of pushing against people's ability to truly achieve equality. I think it's important for us to do that, even as I think that there is something to celebrate about the ideal of equality, at least, and the hope that it could be achieved in some way. And I think that's important whether we're in 2026 or another period. It's certainly true, however, I drafted the book, basically by January of 2025. So a lot's changed since then. I might have changed some of the emphasis and some of the stories. I might have, gone into greater detail on some. On the other hand, what the book is trying to do comes out of the sort of challenges of 2016 and that era, and trying to think about how we can come together even while acknowledging these difficulties, inequalities, and limitations and real tragedies of our past. And I think that remains really important work for all of us.
Well said. So now you got to put on your professor hat. What assignment do you want to give to readers to think about as Americans are contemplating what the United States is 250 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed?
Well, that's a really good question. And even though I might rather put on a party hat than my professor hat, I'll say that one thing I think is really important, as should be clear from the book and this conversation, is that the Declaration of Independence is really worth rereading. So that's where I would start. And in fact, I have my students read it aloud in the course that I still teach at Johns Hopkins. And some of it will land, and it lands differently now than it did even a few years ago. The grievances in particular, and Rob Parkinson's new book is very strong on that. But also to think about the ideals, to think about what can bring us together. It's, fewer than 1,400 words. It's easily available online. That's an easy ask. Of course, one might also look at other kinds of texts that are interesting follow-ups or contemplations of the Declaration, like, of course, Frederick Douglass's 5th of July oration from 1852, like the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls, like a whole lot of different kinds of thinking and exhibits and books that are grappling with what it means to be an American, what the U.S. national project is all about in all kinds of different ways. And I would love for people to engage with both those primary documents in their sort of challenging and curious 18th and 19th century ways, but also, to pick up any books that might be useful, whether it's your wonderful books, Ben, or other books, that are dealing with some aspect of the American experience. I think there's a rich range from which to choose. So that would be, of course, my recommendation, as it always is.
Well, great. Well, that's coming to you from a decorated scholar who had a great career at Cambridge for a few years, except for allowing a certain problematic PhD student to pass. But other than that, and now doing great work at Johns Hopkins. So thank you so much for joining me and answering my questions, Dr. Pearsall.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Ben. It was wonderful to talk with you about the book. Thanks.
Thanks again to Dr. Pearsall for being patient with me and the technical difficulties and also sharing the brilliance of her new book. Again, I strongly recommend it, not just because I'm biased, but this is a very readable, provocative, and revisionist take on the revolution that allows you to understand the broader context and the intimate scope that the 1770s wrought on the globe, not just the 13 colonies. So, in brief, I know this video has gone long, but in brief, I want you to think with me, ruminate on what do these books tell us about our current moment in American history? Because if our contemporary context prompts us to ask questions about the past, we can see a lot of common through lines throughout these recent books that I think are important. One, we see more of an emphasis on the global context. We live in a global world now, and so we're wanting to understand how we got here, seeing that it's not new that we live in an interconnected international order, that was in place and the seeds of those were planted in the 18th century. We also see a lot of emphasis on racial inequalities, trying to understand the systematic problems that still haunt American history, which means that we are trying to reckon with the issues of slavery at the founding, because that's going to give us a lot of insight and the lasting systematic problems that we are wrestling with today. Third, I think we're recognizing a wrestling with federal power, wanting to push back over government overreach, a concept that the federal government can't be trusted, the popular will can. I think there's a greater faith in a populist upswell, which is a bit ironic, given I think both sides will denounce aspects of unbridled populism in the recent years. And finally, one of the things that I really appreciate in this recent historiography that I really think is new for the current moment when compared to, say, all the scholarship that came out in the bicentennial in 1976, is more of a focus on how history is created, how our memory evolves over time. That's why we had so many books that looked at how the revolution has been interpreted since 1783, when the revolution ended, that there is more of a focus on the craft of history and what those digressions and understandings tell us about American society. In other words, the American Revolution has always been important, but why it's important and important to what end is an important lesson that I think these books help us wrestle with. So, as you go out and celebrate the 4th of July this weekend, or at least commemorate if you don't want to celebrate, I hope you at least take some time to contemplate on what the revolution actually means, what that history tells us, and what questions we can ask the past in order to get a better sense of the present. How can we do more to understand the revolution on its own terms, as well as understanding it in a way that helps us be better citizens in the present? In other words, the American Revolution And our commemoration of it on the 4th of July weekend is a wonderful reminder that history has never been more relevant than it is today. And wrestling with that history is so crucial. And that's why I'm glad to be able to do that on the space with all of you today. So have a great 4th of July and read some history for me while you're at it.